Before Herb Baumeister would become a prolific, horrible serial killer, he was a pillar of his community. He was a doting father. He was a loving husband. His neighbors enjoyed spending time with him because he was high energy and he threw great parties. But what people didn't know from outward appearances is that he was schizophrenic and had been diagnosed at a young age. He also had this deep obsession with death and dying that he could never quite shake. His morbid obsession would ultimately take over, and he would go on to end the lives of nearly 24 young men in Indiana. And he would bury the majority of them on his property, which was known as Fox Hollow Farm. When an investigation into all these missing young men in Indiana points at Herb Baumeister being the primary suspect, Baumeister flees his property and ultimately ends his own life. And in the note he leaves, he just says that the reason he's taking his own life is because his business is failing and so is his marriage. He doesn't confess to any of the murders. He doesn't give investigators any indication of how many people he killed or where they are. He didn't give any closure to anyone. He just took his own life, and that was that. And so while investigators did a very thorough search of the property that Baumeister owned, the Fox Hollow Farms property, and found over 5,000 human bone fragments and were able to identify a number of victims, they believe that there are more victims buried at Fox Hollow Farms that we may never uncover. So our story picks up over a decade later when two new owners come in, purchase Fox Hollow Farms, and almost immediately some very strange things start happening in and around the property. Then they record this very famous audio recording inside the property, which that in conjunction with the other strange things that they had seen around the property leads them to believe that Fox Hollow Farms is haunted. So before we get into their story and we listen to that audio recording, if you're interested in strange, dark, and mysterious content like what I'm promising on today's episode, then you've come to the right place, because this is the type of content that I produce 3 to 4 times a week. And so if that interests you, if you would, please gently assassinate the like button and then turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of these uploads every week. So let's dive in. In 2006, Rob, Vicki Graves, and their 2 teenage sons were tired of living the city, fast-paced lifestyle and decided to look for some property in suburban Indiana where they could kind of escape that busy lifestyle. And so when they were looking at real estate in some of the nicer suburbs of Indiana, they found this one property called Fox Hollow Farms that was this huge sprawling estate, but was selling for some unbelievably cheap price. And so they contact a real estate agent who says, yeah, we'd love to give you a tour of the place. It's up for sale. No one's occupying it right now. It's owned by an investor, but they are looking to sell, obviously. So yeah, let's do a house tour. And so they're open-minded. It seems too good to be true, but they decide, you know what, we'll go take a look. And so they get to this property, and it's beautiful. It is everything they wanted this dream home they're looking for to be. You know, it has an indoor swimming pool, it's got loads of bedrooms and bathrooms, it's like basically a mansion. And as they're walking around the property, Rob is speaking to his wife, Vicki, and they're both kind of going back and forth like, what's wrong with this place? This doesn't make any sense. Rob starts to wonder, wait a second, I think I've heard of this place on TV before. And he's having like an epiphany. And he's like, I think that this could actually be the home of one of the most notorious serial killers in Indiana's history, Herb Baumeister. It's like it just came to him that the name Fox Hollow Farm was something he remembered hearing on TV. And so he stops the real estate agent on their tour and he says, hey, this is a beautiful home, but is this the home of Herb Baumeister? And the real estate agent, almost expecting this to be brought up, was like, yes, that's why it's still in the market. People are unwilling to purchase this home, even though the investor who scooped this up in the 90s following the tragedy that was the Herb Baumeister case, the investor had basically gutted the whole residence and basically removed all the kind of remnants of what it used to look like when Herb Baumeister was living there. Nobody wanted it because, you know, Herb Baumeister had killed nearly 24 young men and buried them on the property, and investigators still were finding pieces of bone on the property, and they didn't really know how many victims there were. And so it was this kind of spooky place to live. And so the real estate agent just said, that's why it's so cheap. The property's beautiful, it's well kept, but no one wants to be here because of the history. The real estate agent says, here, why don't you and your wife just go talk about it? We can leave if you guys aren't comfortable with this. Ultimately, they decide to purchase the property. So a couple weeks later, Rob and Vicky and their 2 teenage sons move into Fox Hollow Farms, and they love it. And especially their 2 teenage sons love swimming in the pool. And they had gotten in the habit of basically running around outside and then tracking in dirt and gravel into the swimming pool. And so one day, Vicky is vacuuming up some of this dirt and gravel that had gotten inside of the area around the pool. And so she's vacuuming up the gravel, and all of a sudden her vacuum cuts out. And in fact, the power cord where the vacuum was attached to had come undone. And so she thinks, oh, I must have, yanked on the cord and pulled it out of the outlet. And so she goes over and she plugs it back in, and she goes back to vacuuming up the gravel that was in the pool. And so as she's doing that, it goes out again, which surprised her because she remembered thinking to herself, like, don't yank on the cord because you just unplugged it. And she turns around, and now the cord from the vacuum and the outlet it was plugged into are separated by about a foot. That it was as if it had been like yanked out pretty hard. And she's thinking to herself, like, did I just yank on it again? Like, am I wrapped on a chair or something? Like, how did I yank it out, and how did it move a foot away from the outlet? And so after she plugs it in, she checks it and kind of yanks on it to make sure it's not falling out on its own. Like, it's not a kind of weak connection to the port. And it's not. It's in there secure. And she goes back to vacuuming, and she's looking over her shoulder and checking the outlet as she's vacuuming, like wondering, like, what was causing it to pop out of the socket like that? And as she's looking at it, she watches it pop out of the socket again, except it didn't just fall to the ground. It like jumped out as if there was a surge of electricity that, popped it out of the socket or something. And she drops the vacuum because it startled her, and she didn't know what to make of it. Rob worked at a car dealership, and one of his employees, Joe, was chronically late. And it got to the point where Rob's like, Joe, what's going on? Like, why are you always late? And Joe said, I live over an hour away, and I can't get here on time. I got to find somewhere, to live that's closer to the dealership. And Rob is like, well, actually, we have an entire apartment attached to our residence at Fox Hollow Farms that no one's staying in. We'd be happy to let you rent that out. It's right down the road. And Joe's like, actually, that sounds pretty great. And so just a couple days later, Rob helps Joe move into the new apartment. And they spend the whole day moving all the boxes and furniture in there. And just in the span of just a few hours, they move everything into Joe's apartment. Rob leaves. Joe is exhausted. It's just he and his dog, Fred. And Joe just decides to crash for the night, and he lays down in the bed and falls asleep. And so that night, he has this dream where he's being chased by someone. He doesn't know what it is, but it causes him to actually act out his dream, like sleepwalk. He jumps up out of his bed and starts running as if he needs to escape the apartment, but he's like kind of half dreaming, and he runs into the door frame, falls to the ground, knocks a glass over, and actually cuts his hands up pretty bad. And so he like comes to, and he's like looking around, and he's like, what was that? So a couple days later, Vicky comes home, and she finds Rob painting the side of the house. And she and Rob stop and are talking about how beautiful it's going to look when the painting's done. And out of the corner of her eye, Vicky sees something in the forest that was on the edge of their property. And it was actually a man standing with a red t-shirt on, just standing like looking at their property. And as she's looking at him, he turns around and he starts walking away farther into the forest. And so she kind of looks, and before she says anything to Rob, the guy has just vanished into the woods. And so she just goes, Rob, I just saw someone standing on our property. He had a red shirt on, and he was right over there. And Rob immediately is like, well, honestly, we moved into a serial killer's house. We should accept that there's going to be people that are just going to want to sneak onto our property to get a look at this building. And so they walk over to where Vicky has seen this guy in red, and they look, and there's no one there. They yell out like, hey, is anybody here? And no one's there. And so even though it was pretty unsettling, Vicky and Rob just decide that I guess this is a reality of living here, is that you're going to have people spying on you a little bit because of the notoriety of the home. So later that night, Joe is in his apartment, and he's doing some dishes, and it's late at night, probably like 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and he hears a knock on the door. And he's literally mid-dishes, his hands are wet, and so he turns off the water and he yells out, hey, just a second, and he starts toweling off his hands, and as he's doing that, the knocking gets louder and more aggressive. And he's like, hey, hold on, I'm just drying my hands off, hold on. And he assumes it's Vicky or Rob. And so he starts walking over, and the knocking is just incessant. And he finally opens the door, and no one's there. It wasn't like the knocking was going on and stopped, and then he went over there and opened it. It was literally like the knocking was happening as he's opening the door, and no one is standing there. He's like immediately on guard. Like, okay, is someone like on the roof, like bending down? Is someone hiding? Like, what's going on? And he kind of pokes his head out and he's looking around, and he actually steps out onto the front steps there, and he's looking around, and he figured like if someone had knocked, they'd be running away if they're gone already, and he can't hear anything. It's just silent. There's no one there. And then he goes back into his apartment, shuts it, bolts the door shut, and out of the corner of his eye, he spots what looks like a man in his bedroom, basically just walking past the door frame into his bedroom. And it totally startles him. His dog starts growling and looking in the direction of the bedroom. And so he walks over there and looks in his bedroom, and there's nothing there. He flips on all the lights, he looks around, and he's like, what's going on here? Like, it totally scared him. So Joe had only been in this apartment for about 3 weeks, and one of the things he had kind of developed a habit doing was in the evenings he would take his dog Fred for a walk along the driveway that was, well lit, and the driveway was pretty long. It's a big piece of property, and he would take his dog up to the end of the driveway and then walk back. And because of what he's just witnessed with the knocking on the door and what looked like someone in his apartment, he decides he just wants to clear his head and go on a walk with his dog. And he figured he could maybe swing by the main house and see if the lights were on in Rob and Vicky's house, because in some way, maybe if their lights were on, it would indicate that maybe they had been over and had been knocking on his door, and tomorrow he'll find out what it was about. Like, he's searching for a way to rationalize this. And he notices right away that Vicky and Rob's house is totally dark. They're asleep. He doesn't make it very far when his dog stops. The dog starts taking off into the tree line. And before Joe actually takes off after his dog, he looks up and he breaks out through some of the lighting over the driveway that there is a man in red with a red t-shirt that's at the edge of the forest. And his back is turned and he's walking into the forest, and as Joe's looking, it looks like the man in red actually disappears. And so the dog is heading straight for this man in red, and so Joe, because it's his dog, he loves his dog, he starts running after the dog. Even though he's absolutely terrified of what's going to happen here, he couldn't let his dog get harmed. So he chases into the woods, makes it like a few feet into the woods, where he finds his dog that's now not barking and is actually facing back out at Joe, and it's kind of cowering, looking at where Joe is now standing. And Joe kind of begins to turn, and the man in red is standing right next to him, looking directly at Joe. And Joe just panics and starts running out, doesn't stop to do anything. The dog follows Joe, and they run back to Joe's apartment, run upstairs, shut the doors, shut the blinds, lock everything, and they just sit there. For the rest of the night, Joe is literally checking his window and looking outside, because he doesn't know if he just saw that or not, because that person in red had vanished a minute ago. He thought that perhaps he was convincing himself that he saw someone in red because he had just seen like a ghost in his apartment like a few minutes earlier, and he's starting to think that maybe he's just kind of hallucinating all this stuff, or that he's imagining all this stuff. So he wasn't quite prepared to go tell Rob and Vicky or do anything about it. So he just spent the night basically looking out his window and making sure no one was coming into his residence again. And so the next morning, he goes and tells Rob and Vicky what happened the night before. Everything from the knocking on the door to the person that he thought he saw inside of his apartment, to then ultimately the man in red that his dog chased after. As he's telling them about this exchange with the man in red, Vicky is getting pretty emotional. And Vicky is like, I saw a man in red. And she points to the area of their property, and it's the same area that Joe had just been describing where this had all happened. She was like, I saw a man in red right over there. Like, what's going on? So that night, Joe is in his apartment, and Joe is definitely on edge about what had happened the night before. He's increasingly almost listening for noises outside because of how scary the night before was. And he forgoes his walk on the driveway with his dog. I think he's pretty much done doing that after that encounter. And as he's in his apartment, he hears knocking on the door again. And he yells, who is it? Who's at the door? And no answer, but the knocking continues. And it's one of those knockers. It's the actual knocker on the outside of the door that's being hit over and over again. He can see the door actually shaking from how hard this is being banged against the door. And finally, after like poking his head out and seeing no one, he rips the door open and no one's there. And he looks at the door itself, and the knocker is perpendicular to the ground, like someone's holding it up, but no one's there. And as he's looking at it, it swings down and knocks the door one last time. He slams the door shut, locks it, and he's absolutely petrified. He sees the doorknob on the door start to turn. He can hear the sound of the spring tightening as the doorknob slowly turns all the way over into the open position. The door's locked, but the doorknob's been twisted. And he's looking at the door, and then there's silence after the doorknob's being held in the, call it, open position. And then all of a sudden it bursts open, breaking the lock. No one's outside. And he looks at it and he's absolutely frozen for a second. And then he just runs out of his apartment to see who is doing this. No one's there. When he turns around and looks into his apartment, he sees a man in white, not in red, who is soaked head to toe, screaming and running towards him, who runs out of the apartment past him and vanishes into the air. And so he takes off. Joe, he's not sticking around, grabs his dog, runs to Rob and Vicky's, and he goes in and tells them what happened. Joe, Rob, and Vicky are so scared that now they're not trying to rationalize that this wasn't a ghost, let's say. They're trying to convince themselves that this is a friendly ghost, that these are the victims of Herbert Baumeister that have been tormented by Baumeister, but they're here because they're trapped here. That man you saw in your apartment, that was a victim of Herbert Baumeister, escaping from Herbert Baumeister. The man in red, that was a victim of Herbert Baumeister. We're dealing with the victims here because so many people had their lives snuffed out here. And so it isn't really calming them, but it's like they're creating a narrative that fits what's happening. Because without a story, this is impossible to understand. And so they really start to believe that what they're experiencing is a haunting, but it is of Herb Baumeister's victims basically acting out their final moments or kind of leading them to, what happened to these victims. And so that night, Joe, Rob, and Vicky start going online and researching who the victims were. The known victims of Herb Baumeister. And there's images of all of these different victims. And as they're scrolling through all the pictures, Joe stops them on one and he goes, "That's the guy that was in my apartment. It looks exactly like the guy that was soaking wet, screaming, that ran out of my apartment." Like, that confirms, this is a confirmation to the three of them, that the entity they're experiencing in this property is definitely the victim. So they do feel reassured at this point, scared, but reassured that these are the victims. And so they start really aggressively researching the Baumeister case, and they come to realize that there's actually a number of victims, more than likely, that have not been uncovered, that have been buried on this property, only lending in their mind more credibility to the idea that this is a property that is haunted by the victims of Herb Baumeister. And so after a couple of days where there isn't much activity, Joe decides to go for a walk in the woods in the same area where the man in red had been seen by Vicky and by himself a couple days earlier. And he just decides, in broad daylight, I'm going to go for a walk with my dog out in the woods. And so he starts walking in that direction, and literally sitting on the leaves, like practically on the trail in plain sight, is a human bone. It's a femur bone just sitting on the trail. Like, the idea that that bone wouldn't have been located during the extensive search for bones on this property is nearly impossible. To Joe, the way he described it is, I feel like that bone was left there for me to discover it. That the man in red, who was more than likely a victim of Herb Baumeister, had led me to finding that bone. And so they believe, Joe, Rob, and Vicky, that when they send this bone in for forensic analysis, that they'll determine that this was another victim that perhaps hasn't been identified yet. And they're kind of expecting it to be the man in red, whoever that was. And so Rob ends up calling the lead detective from the Baumeister case and says, "Hey, we found a bone." And so they submit that and they take it in as evidence. And Rob asks the lead investigator if he would mind coming to the property and just kind of explaining to them, where things occurred, on the property relative to the Baumeister case? Where did all the tragedy unfold? Like, where were people buried? Just to give us a sense of what we're dealing with here. And so the investigator agrees, and the investigator comes out, and the vast majority of the killings happened in the swimming pool, where Baumeister would basically lure young men to come to his property to go swimming. And as soon as they got in the pool, he would strangle them to death. And the weird thing about the pool area is that Baumeister was, well, a psychopath, and he had put mannequins all over the inside of this swimming pool that had like party outfits on. And so there are these very eerie pictures of the swimming pool with like mannequins all around the outside, and it was basically a place where he lured his victims and ended their lives. A couple days later, Joe is in his apartment, and he's doing some work at his computer, and he hears a metallic scraping sound coming from his kitchen. And so he goes over to his kitchen, and he finds that all of the knives that were in his butcher's block have been pulled out and lined up neatly in the bottom of his sink, like very neatly arranged. And he's looking at it like, I didn't do that. And he turns towards his workstation, like as if to like look around the room, and he notices on the island that sits where he was standing right in front of him, a little bit low down, like halfway up the island, there was all these fresh cut marks in the wood, like quite a number of cut marks across the wood. And he's looking at that, and he's thinking to himself, is this one of the victims telling me that, perhaps they had been attacked with a knife right here in the kitchen? He's thinking like it's his duty to try to figure out which victim this was and what happened to them. And so he gets his iPhone out, and he turns on the voice recorder, and he starts recording and asking some questions of the room. And he first make sure to turn off the TV, turn off the AC so it's quiet. And so with his recorder, he starts asking, like, who's anybody here? And there's silence. And he's like, who was the person in the kitchen? Who was walking through the kitchen? And there's silence. And then when he asks again about was there anybody in the kitchen, his dog starts growling and reacting to something in the room. And now Joe hasn't heard anything. He's not heard any confirmation that there's someone in the room. He actually felt quite silly doing it. He takes his phone back to his computer because he takes his dog growling as maybe somehow confirmation that there was something there, and he downloads the audio file and he listens to it. And as he's listening to the file, right after he asks about is there anybody in the kitchen, he gets a response.
Who keeps walking in the kitchen?
Who's in the kitchen? The married one. And so as Joe is looking through all their files, he's seeing that every single victim was single. No one's married. They're all young men who are single. The only one who was married, involved in this case, was none other than the serial killer himself, Herb Baumeister. And so Joe has had this revelation, and it's when he realizes that it's not just the victims here. Herb Baumeister, the serial killer himself, is haunting this property. So I'd love to hear what you think is going on at Fox Hollow Farm, whether this is a haunting with Herb Baumeister himself showing himself and speaking on audio files, or if this is just a big hoax. I'd love to hear what you think. And if you want to get in touch with me, please direct message me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallin416. I'm also very active on TikTok. My handle is Mr. Ballin over there as well. And again, if you haven't already, please gently assassinate the like button and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss my 3 to 4 weekly uploads that look and sound an awful lot like this one. That's going to do it, guys. Thank you very much, guys, for sticking around till the very end, and I will talk to you soon.